As you might tell from the color of my little goatee here, I've had some experience with U.S. foreign policy for a long time and began my activism in the peace movement during the first Cold War. And I remember very, very similar allegations about genocide against Ukrainians and a whole movement that was, um, shall we say, developed by you with the assistance of the U.S. intelligence apparatus in this country against, supporting Ukrainian exiles, often of a very hard rate, stripe, to attack the Soviet Union for its attempted genocide against Ukraine. And this was even during the time when the premier of the Soviet Union and the head of the Russian or the Soviet Communist Party was a Ukrainian leader who transferred part of what had historically been Russian territory to the Ukraine. So I really don't see any difference. I think it's so important that the peace movement in this country take a strong position against those who formulate the justifications for imperial policies. Um, and we should have learned that in the first Cold War. Most of the peace movement understood it then. I remember when the Mujahideen were being developed against Afghanistan, similar efforts were made against the Soviet Central Asian republics among the Uzbek and the other people there, where the Soviet Union had to face terrorist attacks in its own territory because of CIA support for them. So I just wanted to ask both of you if you think that this comparison to the history of the US, which, by the way, is at its core and in its DNA a nation based on genocide that developed its wealth and based on a continuing policy against the African American community, which has been brought to the UN as a policy of genocide. I think that's where the US peace movement should target its energies and not removing splinters in the eyes of others. Sorry.
Well, I agree with the sentiment. And I think the US peace movement is it's at a low ebb for a lot of reasons. But it's a part of the anti-racist movement. It's a part of the migrant rights movement. It's a part of so many progressive movements. And it's also able to find cross-partisan alliances of um, a mutual agreement with even people who are libertarian, who don't want to see the U.S. spending $800 billion a year on a bloated war budget that mostly goes back to Beltway bandit contractors. But it's important for people who really identify with the peace movement to be educators, to follow these issues closely, uh, as most Americans don't, and our mainstream media does not want us to, and our foreign policy establishment, which is bipartisan, wants to keep this as undemocratic an issue as possible. It's really our job to democratize foreign policy because the American public, it requires so much coercion more than ever before to support any of these warlike policies. And it benefits not at all from the new Cold War with China. The Pentagon benefits enormously. Many people who live across the river from me, I live in Ward 8 in DC. It's a mostly poor and working class, mostly African-American ward in the city. Across the river, you see the names of the big contractors. You see these new gentrifier lofts going up every day. They're benefiting handsomely from that budget. And this new Cold War aims to justify that budget and the institutional priorities of the Pentagon, all the Beltway bandits, Booz Allen, Hamilton, Raytheon, BAE systems, they're all there. They all depend on this. Additionally, Raytheon is getting a windfall profit from a Biden presidency that pledges to deliver offensive weapons to the Ukrainian military, which you mentioned. And you mentioned, the early anti-Bolshevik network of Ukrainian Banderite exiles, who many of whom were Nazi collaborators during World War II, like Yaroslav Stetsko. They sort of set the stage for this ultranationalist lobby that's been pushing for these weapons along with the defense lobby. And so right now, there's enormous civilian suffering in the Donbass region on the pro-Russian side, where the Ukrainian military is constantly shelling these civilian communities, trying to force people out of their homes so they can move the front lines forward. And the Biden administration is encouraging this. It is deeply, deeply obsessed with this anti-Russian policy. It's pushing it for domestic consumption, and it is sending offensive weapons to the Ukrainian military as a means of encouragement. So it's important for the peace movement to stand up to this policy and to to take a look at the suffering of the people of Donbass. And there's a photographer actually that I found. His name is, I believe it's Dean O'Brien. His Twitter handle is Dino Bino. And he's there on the front lines showing the civilian suffering every day. That's our job, is to show how these policies affect real people. Our slogan or our motto is, to break the media blockade, because just as there are economic sanctions on these countries, there's information sanctions, where people who happen to be inconvenient victims are unable to tell their own story through CNN or BBC or whoever. So that's the job we're trying to do.
Zhun, do you have any comment?
Sure. I agree with what John and Max have mentioned. I think it's important to keep the peace movement in the U.S. going strong. We all know that the U.S. aggressions have caused so much damage, so much harm to the people in the world in the decades past. And they also hurt, I think, to a significant degree, the U.S. people as well. I think the peace movement needs to take back the control of foreign policy. And I think in history, when the U.S. back away from its foreign aggressions, we saw genuine progress in human development in many other parts of the world. With the U.S. intervention, even the local problems, let's say the issues in Xinjiang, the issues in many other places in the world, they get further complicated because the U.S. ruling class is never interested in help you solve the issues. They're trying to conquer. They're trying to do something for their own profits. So without the interference of the U.S. Ruling class, I think we would have more space to provide a genuine solution to many problems that we're facing right now. That's my